To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Ira Stark had built his life on two unshakable pillars, family and land. The 2,000-acre ranch in Montana had been in the Stark family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather who'd claimed it during the Homestead era. The rolling hills, dense forests, and mineral-rich streams weren't just property to Ira. They were legacy, blood, and bone. At 45, Ira possessed the kind of weathered strength that came from decades of hard work. His hands bore the calluses of a man who'd built fence posts in winter storms and delivered calves in midnight blizzards. Standing 6'3" with steel-gray eyes and salt and pepper hair, he commanded respect without demanding it. His reputation in Copper Valley was ironclad, fair but firm, loyal to those who earned it, and utterly ruthless to those who crossed him. The ranch house, a sprawling log structure his grandfather had expanded over the years, sat on a ridge overlooking the valley. It was here that Ira had raised his son Johnny with his wife Carmen, believing their 17-year marriage was as solid as the mountain bedrock beneath their home. Carmen Stark, née Hunter, had been the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into Murphy's Diner on Main Street. At 42, she retained much of the beauty that had first caught Ira's attention at a county fair rodeo. Auburn hair that caught the light, emerald eyes, and a smile that could disarm the surliest rancher. Carmen had seemed like the perfect partner for a man building an empire. Their son Johnny, now 17, had inherited his father's height and his mother's striking features. A senior at Copper Valley High, Johnny was being recruited by several colleges for football while maintaining grades that made Ira proud. The boy had his father's work ethic and what Ira thought was his mother's moral compass. The trouble began on a crisp October morning when Chief of Police Rod Hickey arrived at the ranch in his official cruiser, but this wasn't a professional visit. Rod was Carmen's younger brother, and the resemblance between the siblings was unmistakable. The same auburn hair, the same easy smile that could shift from charming to calculating in an instant. Rod had joined the family through marriage 12 years ago when Carmen introduced her baby brother to Ira. At 38, Rod had worked his way up from patrol officer to chief in the span of a decade, a meteoric rise that Ira had attributed to talent and ambition. Rod was charismatic, well-connected, and had cultivated relationships with everyone who mattered in Copper Valley. "Ira, we need to talk," Rod said, accepting the coffee Carmen offered while they sat in the ranch house kitchen. "I've got a proposition that could benefit us all." The conversation that followed would later replay in Ira's mind like a broken record. Rod wanted to purchase the southern section of the ranch, 800 acres that bordered the highway and included the old mining claims that had been dormant since Ira's grandfather's time. "There's been some interest from developers," Rod explained, his tone casual but his eyes intense. "Resort companies looking at the area. I've got inside information about planned highway expansions. This land could be worth 20 times what you'd expect in 5 years." Ira studied his brother-in-law carefully. Rod wore his police uniform like armor, the badge catching the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. Carmen busied herself cleaning dishes, but Ira noticed how she kept glancing between them, her movements slightly too deliberate. "That land's not for sale," Ira said simply. "Never has been, never will be." Rod's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Come on, Ira. I'm talking about enough money to set Johnny up for life. College, graduate school, whatever he wants. Hell, enough for you and Carmen to retire comfortable." I said no. The finality in Ira's voice made Carmen turn from the sink. "Ira, maybe we should hear him out." "The answer's no, Carmen." Ira's gray eyes never left Rod's face. "That land stays in the family. End of discussion." Rod's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're making a mistake, brother-in-law. Opportunities like this don't come around often. And family land doesn't get sold to the highest bidder. Ever." After Rod left, Carmen was unusually quiet. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, she brought up the subject again. "Rod's just looking out for us," she said, not meeting Ira's eyes. "He knows things, connections we don't have." "Since when do you care about Rod's business connections?" Ira asked, studying his wife's profile in the fading light. "I just think, maybe we should consider all our options. For Johnny's sake." Ira felt something cold settle in his chest, but he dismissed it. Carmen had always been close to her brother, sometimes too close for Ira's liking, but he'd chalked it up to them being each other's only family after their parents died in a car crash 15 years ago. What Ira didn't know was that for the past 8 months, his wife and brother-in-law had been conducting an affair that went far beyond family loyalty. Their relationship had begun during a family dinner the previous winter when Ira had been called away to deal with a sick horse. What started as consolation over shared drinks had evolved into something that threatened everything Ira held sacred. Rod's interest in the land wasn't purely financial, either. He'd been approached by certain individuals, men who didn't appear on any corporate letterhead, but had interests in the undeveloped mineral rights beneath Ira's property. The kind of men who preferred to operate in shadows and didn't take no for an answer gracefully. As Ira watched the stars emerge in the Montana sky, he thought about legacy and trust, about the land his great-grandfather had bled to claim and the family he'd sacrifice everything to protect. He had no idea that the two people he trusted most in the world had already decided he was standing in the way of their future. The countdown to betrayal had begun. Chapter 2. The Perfect Storm. 3 weeks after Rod's visit, Ira noticed the subtle changes in his household like hairline cracks in a foundation. Carmen had become distant, distracted, often lost in thought when she thought he wasn't watching. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Late-night trips to town for groceries or girls' nights, with friends whose names he never heard her mention before. Johnny, meanwhile, was thriving. The boy had just led Copper Valley High to the regional championship, and college scouts were practically camping on their doorstep. Yale and Stanford were among the universities courting him, and Ira felt a fierce pride watching his son handle the attention with the same steady confidence that ran in the Stark bloodline. "Dad, I've been thinking about majoring in agricultural business," Johnny said over dinner one evening. "Maybe coming back to help run the ranch after college." Carmen's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You don't want to limit your options, honey. There's a whole world out there beyond Copper Valley. This ranch is our world," Ira replied, meeting his son's eyes. "And it'll be here for you whenever you're ready." The comment earned him a sharp look from Carmen, but he was too focused on Johnny's response to care. The boy nodded with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of legacy. What Ira didn't know was that his words had sealed his son's fate in Rod and Carmen's eyes. The affair had intensified, and with it, their resentment toward Ira's stubborn refusal to sell. Rod's mysterious benefactors were growing impatient, and the pressure was mounting. Rod had developed a plan as methodical as it was ruthless. He'd been studying Johnny's routines, his friends, his habits. The boy was clean, no drugs, barely drank, honor roll student with a spotless record, which made him the perfect target for a frame job, because who would believe it? The setup began on a Friday night in early November. Johnny was attending a party at his girlfriend's house, Becky Driscoll, daughter of the county assessor. A good girl from a good family, exactly the kind of relationship that made Ira proud of his son's judgment. Rod had been cultivating a relationship with a small-time dealer named Casey Spencer, a 22-year-old dropout who dealt marijuana and occasionally harder substances to high school kids in the next county over. Casey owed Rod a favor, several favors, actually, for looking the other way during minor infractions. "I need you to plant something at a party," Rod told Casey during a meeting at an abandoned grain silo outside town. "Kid named Johnny Stark. Make it look like he's dealing." Casey was nervous, fidgeting with his baseball cap. "Chief, that's the Stark kid. His dad's got serious connections. This could blow back on both of us." Rod's expression turned cold. "You let me worry about Ira Stark. You just do what you're told, or I start remembering all those times I could have arrested you but didn't." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Casey would attend the party with a significant quantity of cocaine, enough to qualify for intent to distribute charges. He'd plant it in Johnny's truck, then call in an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the Driscoll house. Meanwhile, Carmen was handling her part of the operation. She'd been monitoring Johnny's schedule, ensuring she knew exactly when he'd be returning home. More importantly, she'd been planting seeds of doubt about their son's recent behavior. "Ira, have you noticed Johnny's been different lately?" she asked the night before the party. "Different how?" "Just secretive. And he's been spending money. Where's a 17-year-old getting cash for those new clothes, that expensive cologne?" Ira frowned. He had noticed Johnny seemed to have more spending money lately, but he'd assumed it came from his part-time job at the feed store. You think he's into something? Carmen shrugged with practiced nonchalance. I just think we should keep our eyes open. Kids his age can make bad decisions, especially with all the pressure he's under. The conversation was designed to plant doubt, to make Ira question his son's character just enough that when the arrest happened, he might hesitate to defend Johnny with his usual ferocity. On Saturday night, everything went according to plan. Casey showed up at the party fashionably late, blended in with the crowd of teenagers, and slipped the cocaine into Johnny's truck when the boy was inside. The anonymous call came in at 11:47 p.m., and Rod personally responded to the tip about drug activity at the Driscoll residence. Johnny was walking to his truck when the red and blue lights lit up the night. Rod's patrol car pulled into the driveway, followed by two deputies, Alan Hale and Tony Kelly, both men Rod had carefully selected for their loyalty and their willingness to follow orders without asking questions. "Evening, Johnny," Rod said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "We received a report about some suspicious activity here tonight." Johnny's confusion was genuine. "Suspicious activity? Chief Hickey, it's just a party. Nothing crazy. Mind if we take a look at your vehicle?" The boy shrugged, confident in his innocence. "Sure, go ahead." Rod's discovery of the cocaine in the truck's glove compartment was performed with theatrical surprise. The deputies handcuffed Johnny while Rod called it in, his voice carrying just the right note of disappointment for the recording. "This is Chief Hickey. I've got a 17-year-old male in custody for possession with intent to distribute. Subject is Johnny Stark, requesting transport to county lockup." The call to Ira came at 12:23 a.m. Carmen answered the phone, her performance of shock and disbelief worthy of an Oscar. "What? Johnny? Arrested? Ira, wake up. Something's happened to Johnny." Ira was at the county jail within 20 minutes, his mind reeling. The man he'd trusted as family, his own brother-in-law, stood behind the booking desk with an expression of professional regret. "I'm sorry, Ira," Rod said, not meeting his eyes. "I had to do my job. The evidence was right there in his truck." "Evidence?" Ira's voice was deadly quiet. "What evidence?" 2 ounces of cocaine. Street value around $4,000. That's intent to distribute in this county. Ira stared at Rod for a long moment, his gray eyes searching the other man's face for some sign of the family member he trusted. "You're telling me my son is a drug dealer?" "I'm telling you what the evidence says." "I'm sorry, Ira. I really am." But Rod wasn't sorry. As he watched Ira's world begin to crumble, he felt a surge of satisfaction. The stubborn rancher who'd refused to sell his land was about to learn what it cost to defy people who got what they wanted one way or another. The war for the Stark legacy had begun, and Ira didn't even know he was fighting it. Chapter 3: The Web Titans. The preliminary hearing was a nightmare dressed up as due process. Ira sat in the gallery of the Copper Valley Courthouse, watching his son's future evaporate in a cloud of legal jargon and fabricated evidence. Johnny, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that made him look younger than his 17 years, maintained his innocence with the same quiet dignity that was the Stark family trademark. The prosecutor, District Attorney Lowell Donahue, painted a picture of a privileged teenager who'd turned to dealing drugs to fund an expensive lifestyle. He presented the cocaine found in Johnny's truck, witness statements from party attendees who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior, and a compelling narrative about the pressures of college recruitment leading to poor choices. What made it worse was how seamlessly Rod played his part. On the witness stand, he delivered his testimony with the weary professionalism of a lawman who'd been betrayed by someone he'd tried to protect. "Johnny Stark has been like a nephew to me," Rod said, his voice heavy with apparent regret. "I've watched him grow up, been to his football games, celebrated his achievements. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be arresting him for drug dealing, I'd have laughed in their face." The public defender assigned to Johnny's case, a tired-looking man named Perry Bowman who seemed more interested in plea bargaining than fighting, advised the family to consider a deal. "With Chief Hickey's testimony and the physical evidence, we're fighting an uphill battle," Bowman explained during a brief consultation. "The DA's offering 8 years if Johnny pleads guilty to possession with intent, considering he's looking at up to 15 if we go to trial and lose. He's not pleading guilty to something he didn't do," Ira said flatly. Carmen, who'd been unusually quiet during the hearing, finally spoke up. Maybe we should consider it, Ira. 8 years. He'd still be young when he got out. Ira turned to stare at his wife in disbelief. You want our son to confess to being a drug dealer? I want our son to have a future, Carmen shot back, and there was something in her tone, a desperation that went beyond maternal concern. The trial took place 6 weeks later, and it was a masterclass in character assassination. Rod's case file on Johnny was thorough and damning. Bank records showing unexplained cash deposits. Actually, money Rod had planted in Johnny's account through a series of complicated transfers. Testimony from Casey Spencer, who claimed Johnny had approached him about getting into business. Photographs of Johnny at parties where drugs were allegedly present. The most devastating blow came when Carmen took the witness stand. Ira watched in horror as his wife, the woman he'd loved for 17 years, testified against their own son. I started noticing changes in Johnny's behavior about 6 months ago, Carmen said, her voice trembling with what the jury would interpret as maternal anguish. He became secretive, defensive when I asked about his activities. I found cash hidden in his room. When I confronted him about it, he got angry, said things that made me realize I didn't know my son as well as I thought. What kind of things? The prosecutor prompted. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, real tears, born from the guilt of what she was doing. He said that if his father was too stupid to see opportunities when they presented themselves, then someone in the family had to be smart enough to secure their future. It was a lie so expertly crafted that even Ira felt a moment of doubt. The words sounded like something an arrogant teenager might say, and Carmen's delivery was heartbreakingly convincing. Johnny's own testimony was passionate, but ultimately ineffective against the mountain of fabricated evidence. The jury saw a privileged kid making excuses, not an innocent young man fighting for his life. The verdict came back guilty on all charges. 12 years in the state penitentiary, with the possibility of parole in 8. As the bailiff led his son away in shackles, Johnny turned to look at his father one last time. The boy's eyes held no anger, no accusation, just a sadness that cut Ira deeper than any blade. That night, Ira sat in his study staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Carmen found him there as midnight approached. I know you hate me right now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I had to tell the truth about what I saw. Ira looked up at her, and Carmen took a step back at what she saw in his eyes. The truth. The money, the behavior changes. Get out. Ira, get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. Carmen left the room, but not before Ira saw something flicker across her face. Relief. She was relieved that Johnny was gone, relieved that the immediate crisis was over. That's when Ira knew with absolute certainty that his wife had lied on the witness stand. The question was why, and how deep the betrayal went. Over the following weeks, Ira began to notice things he'd missed before. Carmen's late-night phone calls that she claimed were with her book club, the new clothes that appeared in her wardrobe, the way she flinched when he touched her, as if contact with him physically repulsed her. The truth hit him like a sledgehammer 3 months after the trial, when he saw Carmen and Rod together at Morrison's hotel on the outskirts of the next county. They were in the parking lot, and Rod had Carmen pressed against the side of his patrol car, kissing her with the passion of longtime lovers. Ira sat in his truck, watching the two people he'd trusted most in the world betray everything sacred between them. The rage that filled him was so pure, so absolute, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. His son was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His wife was sleeping with the man who'd put him there, and Ira was sitting alone on his land, surrounded by the ghosts of 4 generations of Stark men who'd built this legacy with their blood and sweat. That's when Ira Stark began to plan his revenge. Chapter 4, The Long Game. Prison changed Johnny in ways that broke his father's heart during their weekly visits. The boy who'd entered the state penitentiary with earnest eyes and unshakable faith in justice emerged as something harder, more guarded. By his 2nd year inside, Johnny had developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. The appeals court denied us again, Ira told his son during a visit in the sterile prison conference room. Bowman says we've exhausted our options. Johnny nodded with the resigned acceptance of someone twice his age. It's okay, Dad. I've made peace with it. But Ira hadn't made peace with anything. For 18 months, he'd been conducting a different kind of investigation, one that operated outside the boundaries of law and conventional morality. What he discovered had transformed his grief into something far more dangerous: absolute clarity of purpose. The affair between Carmen and Rod had been going on for 2 years, not 8 months as Ira had initially estimated. Their relationship had begun during a family barbecue when Ira had been called away to deal with a medical emergency involving one of his ranch hands. What started as Carmen seeking comfort during a moment of crisis had evolved into a systematic betrayal that included not just adultery, but conspiracy to destroy their own son. Ira had proof now. Photographs taken by a private investigator named Israel Brewer, a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases. Bank records showing cash flows between Rod and Casey Spencer. Phone records revealing hundreds of calls between Carmen and Rod in the months leading up to Johnny's arrest. But the most damning evidence had come from an unexpected source: Casey Spencer himself. The young man who'd planted the drugs in Johnny's truck had developed a serious cocaine habit of his own, funded by the money Rod had paid him for his testimony. When Casey's supplier was arrested in a DEA sting operation, he'd found himself in federal custody, facing 25 years for trafficking charges. That's when Casey Spencer decided to trade information for a reduced sentence. "I can give you a police chief," Casey had told the federal prosecutors. "A dirty cop who paid me to frame an innocent kid. I've got records, dates, everything." The federal investigation into Rod Hickey was being conducted in absolute secrecy, but Ira had cultivated a relationship with one of the agents involved, a man named Jeremy, who'd grown up on a ranch not unlike Ira's, and understood the importance of justice for a wrongfully imprisoned son. "We're building a case," Jeremy told Ira during a clandestine meeting at a truck stop 50 miles from Copper Valley. "But these things take time. Rod's careful, and he's got friends in high places. We need every piece of evidence to be bulletproof." "How long?" Ira asked. 12 to 18 months. Maybe longer. Ira stared across the parking lot at the mountains in the distance. "My son doesn't have that kind of time. He's dying in there, one day at a time." "I understand your frustration." "No," Ira said quietly. "You don't." That conversation had taken place 6 months ago. Since then, Ira had been preparing for the possibility that the legal system would fail his son just as completely as it had during the original trial. He'd begun liquidating assets in ways that couldn't be traced back to him, selling cattle to buyers in neighboring states, converting precious metals and jewelry into untraceable cash. He'd also been studying his enemies with the patience of a hunter tracking prey. Rod Hickey lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of Copper Valley, though he spent most nights at Morrison's Hotel with Carmen. His routines were predictable: coffee at Murphy's Diner every morning at 7, lunch at the same table in the back corner. He drove the same routes, stopped at the same places, lived a life of comfortable patterns that made him an easy target for someone with patience and planning. Carmen had moved out of the ranch house 3 months after Johnny's conviction, claiming she needed space to process everything that's happened. She'd taken an apartment above the bank on Main Street, but Ira knew she was really living with Rod at the hotel. The apartment was just a prop in their elaborate theater of deception. What neither Rod nor Carmen knew was that Ira had been inside both locations. Morrison's Hotel had been built in the 1920s, and its security was practically non-existent. The apartment above the bank was even easier. Carmen had given Ira a key during their marriage, and he'd had copies made before she changed the locks. He'd installed surveillance equipment in both places. Cameras no bigger than shirt buttons, recording devices that could pick up conversations through walls. For months, he'd been documenting their relationship, their plans, their complete lack of remorse for what they'd done to Johnny. The recordings were particularly illuminating. "How much longer do we have to keep this up?" Carmen had asked Rod during one late-night conversation at the hotel. "Living in separate places, pretending we're not together?" "Until the heat dies down," Rod had replied. "And until we figure out what to do about Ira. He's not going to just roll over and accept this. Maybe if we gave him some of the money from the land deal." "There is no land deal, Carmen. Not anymore. My contacts moved on to other opportunities after Ira refused to sell. We're in this position because of his stubborn pride. So what do we do?" Rod's answer had chilled Ira to the bone. "We wait for him to have an accident. Ranching's dangerous work. Accidents happen all the time." That conversation had taken place 2 weeks ago, and it had convinced Ira that the time for passive investigation was over. Rod and Carmen weren't just content with destroying Johnny's life and stealing his wife. They were actively planning Ira's murder. The war had escalated, and Ira intended to win it. He'd already identified his first target, Casey Spencer. The young man was currently serving his reduced sentence in a minimum security federal facility in Wyoming, but he was scheduled for release in 6 months. Casey was the weak link in Rod's conspiracy, the one person whose testimony could unravel everything. Ira had been cultivating relationships with certain individuals, men who operated in the shadows of the prison system, who could arrange for things to happen to specific inmates. The kind of men his great-grandfather had known during the Homestead era, when justice was often a matter of personal accountability rather than legal process. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Casey Spencer would suffer a fatal accident during his final months in federal custody. A fall in the shower, perhaps, or a reaction to contaminated prison food. The kind of accident that happened to snitches all the time in the federal system. With Casey dead, Rod's house of cards would be much harder to topple. But that was just the beginning of Ira's revenge. He had plans for Rod and Carmen that would make Casey's death look like a mercy killing. Because Ira Stark was about to teach them both that some betrayals carried prices that could never be paid in full. Chapter 5. Blood Money. Casey Spencer died on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months before his scheduled release. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack brought on by an undiagnosed congenital condition, though the prison medical examiner noted some unusual bruising around the young man's throat that suggested possible complications during resuscitation attempts. The news reached Ira through Jeremy Yu, who called with barely concealed frustration. "Our star witness is dead," the federal agent said without preamble. "And with him goes our best shot at bringing down your brother-in-law." Ira received the call while standing in his father's study, surrounded by 4 generations of Stark family photographs. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Unfortunate. Ira, this sets our investigation back by years. Without Casey's testimony, we're back to circumstantial evidence and hearsay." "I understand." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You don't sound surprised." "Nothing surprises me anymore, Agent Q." After ending the call, Ira allowed himself a small smile. Casey Spencer's death had cost him $15,000 and several favors owed to men who preferred to remain anonymous, but it was money well spent. With the federal investigation crippled, Rod would become overconfident, sloppy, and sloppy people made mistakes. The next phase of Ira's plan involved something far more personal, destroying Rod and Carmen's relationship from within. He'd spent months studying their dynamic, understanding the psychological pressure points that kept them together. Guilt, greed, and mutual dependence were the pillars of their partnership. All Ira had to do was systematically destroy each one. He began with greed. Using contacts he'd developed through decades of ranching, Ira arranged for Rod to receive an anonymous tip about a major drug shipment passing through Copper Valley. The information was real. Ira had purchased it from the same network of criminals he'd used to eliminate Casey Spencer. A truck carrying 50 kilograms of pure Colombian cocaine would be traveling Highway 87 on Thursday night, making a scheduled stop at the Moonlight Truck Plaza. What Rod didn't know was that the federal DEA had been tracking this shipment for months as part of a larger investigation into cartel activity in the Pacific Northwest. The moment Rod moved to intercept the drugs for his own purposes, he'd be walking into a federal surveillance operation. Ira watched from a ridge overlooking the truck plaza as Rod's carefully planned theft unfolded exactly as predicted. The police chief arrived in an unmarked vehicle, approached the truck driver with what appeared to be a routine inspection, then supervised the transfer of several duffel bags into his own car. What Rod didn't see were the federal agents photographing every moment of the transaction from multiple angles, or the GPS tracking devices they'd already planted on the cocaine shipment. Within 48 hours, Rod was under federal surveillance. His bank accounts were being monitored, his communications intercepted, his every movement documented by agents who now had him dead to rights on federal drug trafficking charges. The pressure began to show almost immediately. Rod became paranoid, suspicious, checking over his shoulder constantly. His relationship with Carmen grew strained as he became increasingly demanding and controlling. "Something's wrong," Carmen told her reflection in the hotel room mirror, unaware that Ira was listening through the surveillance devices he'd planted. Rod's acting crazy, talking about people watching him, following him around. Maybe he's just stressed about work, Rod replied, but his voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. This isn't stress, Rod. This is something else. And I'm starting to think we made a mistake. A mistake? Which part? Getting rid of Johnny, or planning to get rid of Ira? Carmen's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the hidden microphone. You said that was just talk. You said we were just fantasizing. I say a lot of things, Carmen. But Ira's not going to just roll over and let us live happily ever after. He's suspicious, he's asking questions, and sooner or later he's going to figure out what really happened to his precious son. So what are you suggesting? Rod's answer was delivered with the cold calculation of a man who'd already crossed every moral line that mattered. I'm suggesting we move up our timeline. There's going to be a hunting accident this weekend. Tragic case of mistaken identity. Ira gets shot by a poacher who disappears into the mountains. Carmen was quiet for a long moment. And then what? We inherit the ranch and live happily ever after. Something like that. What about Johnny? He's still going to be in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Rod's laugh was ugly. Johnny's not our problem anymore. He'll adapt, or he won't. Either way, he's never getting out of that cage. The conversation confirmed what Ira had already suspected. His wife and brother-in-law weren't just adulterers and conspirators, they were planning his murder. The knowledge filled him with a cold fury that went beyond anger into something approaching religious conviction. It was time to escalate his own timeline. The next morning, Ira visited his son for what he knew would be their last conversation behind prison walls. Johnny looked older, harder, but his eyes still held the spark of intelligence that made Ira proud. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you," Johnny said after they'd exchanged the usual pleasantries. "I've been talking to some people in here. People who know things about what happened to me." Ira leaned forward, genuinely surprised. "What kind of things?" "There's a guy named Julio Hernandez, serving time for armed robbery. He used to deal drugs in the county next to ours. Says he knew Casey Spencer, the guy who testified against me. And," Johnny's voice dropped to a whisper, "Julio says Casey bragged about being paid to frame someone. Said a police chief gave him $5,000 to plant drugs on a rich kid and testify about it in court." Ira felt his heart rate accelerate. Did Casey mention any names? Not directly, but Julio's got a good memory for details. Casey said the cop was sleeping with the kid's mother, and they wanted the son out of the way so they could steal his inheritance. It was vindication, but vindication that would never see the inside of a courtroom. Casey was dead. Julio was a convicted felon whose testimony would be dismissed, and the legal system had already failed Johnny once. "Son," Ira said carefully, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I've never stopped believing in your innocence. And I've never stopped working to prove it." Johnny nodded, understanding something in his father's tone that went beyond words. "I know, Dad, and I want you to know that whatever you have to do, I understand." The statement hung between them like a benediction and a farewell. Ira reached across the table and clasped his son's hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from prison labor. "Your grandfather always said that justice and law aren't the same thing," Ira said. "Sometimes a man has to choose between them." What did he choose? Ira's smile was cold as mountain water. Justice. Every single time. As he drove home from the prison, Ira's phone rang. The caller ID showed Jeremy Yu's number. "We've got him," the federal agent said without preamble. "Rod Hickey's looking at 25 to life on federal trafficking charges. We're moving to arrest him tomorrow morning." "That's good news," Ira replied, though his voice carried no satisfaction. "There's more. We found evidence linking him to at least 3 other frame jobs over the past 5 years. This guy's been using his badge to destroy people's lives for money." "What about my son's case?" "That's the complicated part. With Casey Spencer dead and no other witnesses, we still can't prove Johnny was framed. Rod's arrest might create enough doubt for an appeal, but probably not. Probably not. I'm sorry, Ira." Ira ended the call and pulled over to the side of the highway. In the distance, he could see his ranch house, the land his family had bled to claim and hold. Tomorrow, Rod Hickey would be arrested and his conspiracy would begin to unravel. But Johnny would still be in prison, and Carmen would still be free to inherit everything Ira had built if something happened to him. That was unacceptable. It was time for the final phase of his revenge, the part that would require him to cross lines that could never be uncrossed. Ira Stark was about to become the kind of man his great-grandfather had been during the Homestead era, judge, jury, and executioner all in one. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, there would be no mercy for those who had betrayed his blood. Chapter 6. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. Rod Hickey's arrest sent shockwaves through Copper Valley that registered on every social seismograph in the county. The charges were federal and devastating: trafficking, conspiracy, abuse of power under color of authority, and racketeering. The FBI raid on his house and office uncovered evidence of corruption that went back years: planted evidence, falsified reports, witness intimidation. But what terrified Rod most wasn't the federal charges. It was the growing certainty that Ira Stark was orchestrating his downfall with surgical precision. The realization had come during his interrogation by federal agents, when they presented him with surveillance footage of his drug theft at the truck plaza. The camera angles were too perfect, the timing too convenient. Someone had known exactly where to be and when to be there to document his crime. "Someone set me up," Rod told his lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Leslie Valentine who specialized in defending dirty cops. "This whole thing was a trap." "Set up by whom?" Valentine asked, reviewing the evidence files spread across the jailhouse conference table. "Ira Stark, my brother-in-law. He knows about me and Carmen, knows I framed his son. He's been planning this." Valentine looked skeptical. "You're talking about a rancher, not a criminal mastermind. How would he have access to federal drug shipments and DEA surveillance equipment?" Rod's laugh was bitter. "You don't know Ira. That family's been in this valley for 4 generations. They know people, have connections you wouldn't believe. And Ira doesn't forgive. Ever." The lawyer made a note on her legal pad. "Assuming you're right about his involvement, what exactly do you think he's planning?" "To destroy everything I care about, starting with my freedom and working his way up to my life." As if summoned by Rod's paranoia, Carmen arrived at the county jail an hour later for what would be their final conversation as lovers. She looked haggard, frightened, nothing like the confident woman who'd testified against her own son 2 years earlier. "They're saying you stole drugs," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're saying you've been corrupt for years." "It's all Ira," Rod replied through the reinforced glass that separated them. "He orchestrated this whole thing. The drug shipment, the surveillance, everything." Carmen's face went pale. How could he know about the drugs? How could he arrange? "The same way he's been staying one step ahead of us this whole time. He's been watching, listening, planning. And now he's making his move." "What are we going to do?" Rod leaned forward, his voice urgent. "You need to disappear. Tonight. Take whatever cash you have and get as far away from Copper Valley as possible." "I can't just disappear. I have a life here, a job. You have a target on your back." Rod's voice cracked with desperation. "Ira's not going to stop with me. You betrayed his son, Carmen. You think he's going to let that slide?" Carmen's hands were shaking as she pressed them against the glass. "Maybe if I talk to him, explained." "Explained what?" "That you've been sleeping with the man who destroyed Johnny's life? That you lied on the witness stand to send your own son to prison? There's no explanation that's going to save you." The conversation ended with Carmen in tears and Rod being led back to his cell, where he spent the night staring at the ceiling and wondering if Ira Stark was patient enough to let the legal system destroy him, or if something more immediate was being planned. Meanwhile, across town, Ira was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would make Rod's federal troubles seem like a minor inconvenience. He'd spent weeks studying the jail's security protocols, guard schedules, and inmate routines. Rod was being held in protective custody, which meant he was isolated from the general population, but also more predictable in his movements. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he was allowed 1 hour of exercise in a small outdoor yard surrounded by 20-foot walls topped with razor wire. The yard was monitored by 2 guards and a single security camera mounted on the east wall. But the camera had a blind spot, a small section near the northwest corner where the angle couldn't capture activity, close to the wall. Ira had identified this vulnerability during his careful reconnaissance, conducted over multiple visits to see Johnny at the prison. The county jail and state penitentiary shared some security contractors, and Ira had cultivated relationships with men who understood that loyalty could be purchased for the right price. The plan was elegant and untraceable. During Rod's Thursday exercise period, a small drone would drop a package into the blind spot of the yard. The package would contain a sharpened piece of metal, essentially a prison shank, along with a note claiming responsibility for Johnny Stark's frame-up. When Rod's body was discovered, it would appear that someone from Johnny's network of supporters had managed to smuggle a weapon into the jail for revenge purposes. The investigation would focus on prison security failures and inmates smuggling rings, not on a grieving father with seemingly airtight alibis. But Wednesday night brought an unexpected complication. Ira received a call from Jeremy Yu, the federal agent who'd been investigating Rod's corruption. "We need to talk," you said. "Tonight. It's about your wife." They met at the same truck stop where they'd had their previous clandestine conversations, but this time Yu's demeanor was entirely different. Gone was the sympathetic agent who understood a father's pain. In his place sat a federal investigator who'd connected some very disturbing dots. "Carmen's been talking," you said without preamble. "She's scared, looking for a deal. Says she has information about other crimes Rod committed, other people he framed." Ira kept his expression neutral. "That's good news for Johnny's appeal." "Maybe. But here's the interesting part. She also claims that someone's been stalking her, following her, taking pictures. She thinks it's you. Carmen's been under a lot of stress lately." You pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "These were taken from her hotel room yesterday by our technical team. Surveillance equipment, professionally installed. The kind of gear that requires specialized knowledge and connections." Ira looked at the photographs of his own surveillance devices without showing any reaction. "Someone's been spying on my wife. Someone's been conducting a very sophisticated intelligence operation against both your wife and Rod Hickey. The equipment we found suggests months of planning and significant financial resources. Do you have any suspects?" Yu's stare was steady and knowing. "Just one. A man with motive, means, and opportunity. A man who might be planning something that goes beyond legal justice." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each understanding exactly what wasn't being said. "Agent Yu," Ira finally said, "what exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking you not to do whatever you're planning to do. Let the system work. Rod's going away for decades. Carmen's going to testify against him, which means she'll be under federal protection but also federal scrutiny for the rest of her life. You've already won." Ira smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Yu's hand move unconsciously toward his service weapon. "Have I?" Ira asked. "My son is still in prison for a crime he didn't commit. My wife is still free after committing perjury that destroyed an innocent boy's life. Rod's facing drug charges, not charges related to Johnny's frame-up. From where I sit, Agent Yu, the system is still failing my family. The appeals process could take years, and might fail anyway." Ira stood up, tossing a $20 bill on the table to cover his coffee. "I appreciate everything you've done, Agent Yu. But some forms of justice can't be delivered by federal agents or court proceedings." As Ira walked toward his truck, you called after him. "If you cross that line, I'll have to stop you. Badge or no badge. I'll do whatever it takes to prevent you from becoming the kind of man you'll regret being." Ira paused at his truck door, looking back at the federal agent who'd become an unexpected ally and was now positioning himself as an obstacle. "Agent Yu," Ira said quietly, "I became that man the day they sent my innocent son to prison. The only question now is how many people are going to pay the price for creating him." The drive back to the ranch was the longest of Ira's life, filled with the weight of decisions that would define not just his future, but his soul. Tomorrow, Rod Hickey would die in the county jail yard. Friday, Carmen would discover that federal protection couldn't save her from a man who'd learned to hunt in the mountains of Montana. The final act of Ira Stark's revenge was about to begin, and mercy was no longer part of the equation. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Thursday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of mountain weather that made men check their weapons and trust their instincts. Ira stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the sun struggle through low-hanging clouds as he made his final preparations for Rod Hickey's execution. The drone was a custom-built machine, small enough to avoid radar detection, but sophisticated enough to deliver its payload with surgical precision. Ira had purchased it through intermediaries, using cash and false identification documents that would trace back to a dead end. The weapon, a sharpened piece of prison-grade steel, was wrapped in a note claiming responsibility for the murder on behalf of Johnny's supporters. At 2:47 p.m., Rod would begin his scheduled exercise period in the county jail yard. At 2:52 p.m., when the guards were focused on a staged distraction involving another inmate, the drone would make its delivery. At 2:53 p.m., Rod Hickey would die screaming, and the first phase of Ira's revenge would be complete. But at 9:30 a.m., "Jeremy, you called with news that would change everything. Carmen's dead," the federal agent said without preamble. Ira nearly dropped his coffee mug. "What? Apparent suicide. Hotel housekeeping found her this morning. Single gunshot to the head, Rod's service weapon. Note confessing to perjury in Johnny's trial." The news hit Ira like a physical blow. Carmen was supposed to die by his hand, after understanding exactly why she was being punished and by whom. Her suicide robbed him of the satisfaction of watching her face when she realized the price of betrayal. "What did the note say?" Ira asked. "Basically a full confession. She admits to lying on the witness stand, confirms that Rod framed Johnny, details the whole conspiracy. It's enough to get your son's conviction overturned immediately." Ira sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, his mind racing to process this unexpected development. "So Johnny's free?" "As good as. The state attorney general's office is preparing emergency paperwork to vacate the conviction. Your son could be out by the end of the week." It was everything Ira had wanted, delivered by the woman he'd planned to torture and kill. Carmen's final act had been one of redemption, saving the son she'd helped destroy while simultaneously making her own death unnecessary. But Rod was still alive, still breathing, still unpunished for what he'd done to Johnny. "Agent Q," Ira said carefully, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for my family." "Don't thank me yet. There's more." Ira braced himself for another revelation. Carmen's suicide note also names other victims of Rod's frame-ups. 3 other families, going back 5 years. All cases where Rod planted evidence or coerced testimony to convict innocent people. The scope of Rod's corruption was staggering, but it also presented Ira with an unexpected opportunity. If other families had suffered the same injustice as the Starks, then Rod's death could be attributed to any number of grieving relatives seeking revenge. "When will this information be made public?" Ira asked. "Probably tonight. The FBI is coordinating with local media to ensure maximum coverage." And Rod? Still in custody, still facing federal charges. But now he's also looking at additional state charges for conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. He's never getting out, Ira. Never. It should have been enough. Rod would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, surrounded by the kind of men who had special hatred for dirty cops. He'd live in constant fear, knowing that every day could be his last, that justice would eventually find him in the form of a sharpened toothbrush or a contaminated meal. But it wasn't enough for Ira. Prison was just another form of existence, not the ending that Rod deserved. The man who destroyed Johnny's youth and stolen 2 years of his life deserved something more immediate, more personal. At 2:30 p.m., Ira activated the drone from his position on a ridge overlooking the county jail. The small aircraft rose silently into the gray sky, its electric motors barely audible above the wind. Through the drone's camera, Ira could see the exercise yard below, could see Rod pacing near the northwest corner like a caged animal. The guards were positioned exactly as Ira had predicted. The security camera was pointed away from the drop zone. Everything was perfect for the kind of precision killing that would be attributed to gang activity or revenge from other victims' families. But as Ira guided the drone toward its target, he felt something unexpected: doubt. Johnny was going to be free. The truth about his innocence would be public knowledge within hours. Carmen was already dead, having chosen her own punishment rather than accepting his. Rod would spend the rest of his life in a cage, just as he'd intended for Johnny. The revenge that had consumed Ira for 2 years was essentially complete. The only thing left was killing Rod, and that would be murder, not justice. For the first time since beginning his campaign of retribution, Ira hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Rod looked up at the sky as if sensing the drone's presence. Even through the camera's limited resolution, Ira could see the fear in his brother-in-law's eyes, the desperate paranoia of a man who knew death was coming but not when or how. Rod raised his hand, pointing directly at the drone, and shouted something to the guards. Chaos erupted in the exercise yard. Guards rushed toward Rod's position while scanning the sky for threats. Alarms began to sound. The jail went into immediate lockdown. Ira had two choices: complete the mission and drop the weapon, turning Rod's death into a certainty, or abort and let the legal system deliver its own form of justice. For a long moment, the drone hovered motionless above the yard while Ira wrestled with the decision that would define the man he chose to become. Then he made his choice. The drone climbed rapidly, disappearing into the cloud cover as guards below scrambled to track its flight path. Within minutes, it was back on the ridge where Ira waited, the weapon still attached to its payload mechanism. Rod Hickey would live to face trial, to spend decades in federal prison, to wake up every morning knowing that his own corruption had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. But he would live. Ira drove home as the first news reports began broadcasting Carmen's confession. By evening, Johnny's name would be cleared. By the weekend, his son would be free. The revenge was complete, delivered not by Ira's hand, but by the weight of truth and the consequences of betrayal. Sometimes, Ira realized, the best justice was simply allowing people to face the full consequences of their own choices. Rod Hickey would spend the rest of his life in a cage, knowing that he'd lost everything because he couldn't resist the temptation to destroy an innocent family. That knowledge, Ira decided, was punishment enough. Chapter 8. The Return of the Prodigal Son. Johnny Stark walked out of the state penitentiary on a Friday morning in April, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of personal belongings and wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in 2.5 years earlier. The boy who'd entered prison at 17 emerged as a young man of 20, harder and more self-contained, but with eyes that still held the steady intelligence that made his father proud. Ira was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, when Johnny emerged from the concrete fortress that had stolen his youth. The reunion was quiet, marked by a long embrace that spoke to everything they'd endured and everything they'd lost. "You ready to come home?" Ira asked. Johnny nodded, but his expression was complicated. Home feels like a foreign concept right now. The drive back to Copper Valley was mostly silent, with both men processing the magnitude of what had changed. Carmen was dead, buried in the small cemetery overlooking the valley after a sparsely attended funeral that neither Ira nor Johnny had attended. Rod was in federal custody awaiting trial, his life and career destroyed by the revelation of his systematic corruption. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately favorable to the Stark family. Johnny was portrayed as a tragic victim of police corruption, while Ira was depicted as a steadfast father who'd never given up faith in his son's innocence. The true scope of Ira's investigation and planning remained hidden, known only to Jeremy Yu, who'd chosen to file his final report without mentioning his suspicions about Ira's extracurricular activities. "Dad," Johnny said as they crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, "I need you to know something. I'm not the same person I was when they took me away." Ira glanced at his son, noting the way Johnny's hands remained relaxed but ready, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. Prison had taught the boy vigilance and survival skills that would serve him well in the world beyond bars. "Neither am I," Ira replied honestly. The ranch house felt cavernous with just the two of them rattling around in rooms that had once housed a family. Carmen's presence had been erased systematically, her photographs removed, her belongings donated to charity, her very existence scrubbed from the domestic landscape she'd helped create. Over the following weeks, father and son began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship while learning to function as a family unit of two. Johnny threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if physical labor could somehow purge the contamination of his prison experience. But it was during their evening conversations on the porch that Ira began to understand the depth of his son's transformation. "There's something I need to tell you about Casey Spencer," Johnny said one night, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing dangerous topics. Ira's attention sharpened. "What about him?" "Julio Hernandez, the guy I told you about, the one who knew Casey. He had some interesting things to say about Casey's death." "Such as?" Johnny's smile was cold and knowing. "Such as the fact that Casey was bragging right up until the end about how he was going to cut a deal with the feds, how he was going to testify against a police chief and get a reduced sentence." Ira kept his expression neutral. Prison's full of men who think they're smarter than they actually are. True. But Julio also mentioned that word got around about Casey's deal. Word that reached certain people who don't appreciate snitches. And 3 days later, Casey had his heart attack. Funny how these things work out sometimes. The conversation was a dance around the truth, both men understanding exactly what wasn't being said. Johnny knew or suspected that his father had arranged Casey's death, just as Ira understood that his son was testing his reaction to see how much truth he could handle. Sometimes, Ira said carefully, justice finds its own way of working itself out. Johnny nodded slowly. Sometimes it does. The subject of Casey Spencer was never mentioned again, but it established a new understanding between father and son. They were both men who'd been pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional morality, and they were both comfortable existing in that gray zone where justice and revenge converged. A month after Johnny's release, they received an unexpected visitor. Jeremy Yu arrived at the ranch in an unmarked federal vehicle, wearing civilian clothes and the expression of a man conducting unofficial business. Agent Yu. Ira greeted him from the porch steps. This is a surprise. I was in the area, thought I'd stop by and see how Johnny's adjusting to freedom. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee while you made small talk about Johnny's plans for the future and Ira's intentions for the ranch. But eventually, the conversation turned to more serious matters. Rod's trial is set for September, you said. With Carmen's confession and the additional evidence we've gathered, he's looking at 3 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. That's good news, Ira replied. It is. But there's something else you should know. Rod's been talking, trying to cut his own deal. He's claiming that someone orchestrated his downfall, manipulated events to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. Johnny's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. Is anyone listening to him? Yu's smile was sardonic. Not particularly. Rod's credibility is somewhere below 0 at this point. Plus, his claims don't make much sense. He's suggesting that a rancher with no law enforcement background somehow orchestrated a complex federal sting operation. Sounds pretty far-fetched, Ira agreed. It does. Still, I thought you should know he's pointing fingers in your direction. Not that it matters. He's going away forever regardless of what he claims. After you left, Johnny and Ira sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains that had sheltered their family for 4 generations. Dad, Johnny said eventually, can I ask you something? Anything. If Rod had been found dead in that jail cell, would you have been able to live with yourself? Ira considered the question carefully. Honestly, I don't know, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. Johnny nodded, understanding the complexity of his father's moral calculus. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Even though he's still alive, especially because he's still alive, death would have been easy for him. This way, he gets to spend the next 40 years thinking about what he lost and why he lost it. As darkness settled over the valley, Ira reflected on the strange mathematics of revenge. He'd set out to destroy the people who'd betrayed his family, and in the end, they destroyed themselves. Carmen's guilt had driven her to suicide. Rod's greed had led him into a federal trap. Casey's cooperation with authorities had made him a target for the very criminals he'd worked with. Justice had been served, but not in the way Ira had originally planned. Sometimes, he realized, the most effective revenge was simply giving people enough rope to hang themselves. The Stark family had emerged from their ordeal scarred but intact, stronger for having endured betrayal and survived it. The land remained in their hands, the legacy preserved for future generations. In the end, that was all that truly mattered. Chapter 9, Legacy of Iron. 2 years after Johnny's release, the Stark Ranch had settled into a new rhythm that reflected the hard lessons learned during their trial by fire. Father and son worked the land with a shared understanding of what they'd almost lost and what they'd fought to preserve. Johnny had grown into his father's boots in more ways than one. At 22, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be taught, only earned through surviving betrayal and emerging stronger. He'd taken over much of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Ira to focus on the longer-term strategic planning that would secure their legacy for generations to come. The young man had also inherited his father's capacity for absolute loyalty and absolute ruthlessness. This became evident when a group of developers from Denver arrived with a new offer to purchase the southern section of the ranch. The the same land Rod Hickey had tried to force them to sell. The meeting took place in Ira's study, surrounded by 4 generations of Stark family photographs and the mounted heads of elk and deer that had fed the family through lean winters. The lead developer, a smooth-talking man named Donald Leach, presented his offer with the kind of polished confidence that came from closing deals worth millions. "We're prepared to offer $15 million for the southern 800 acres, Leach said, sliding a contract across the oak desk that had belonged to Ira's grandfather. "That's nearly double what the land's assessed value shows." Ira didn't touch the contract. "The land's not for sale. Mr. Stark, with respect, this is an extraordinary opportunity. The proposed highway expansion is going to make this property incredibly valuable. We're offering you the chance to cash in before the market gets saturated." Johnny, who'd been standing silently by the window, turned to face the developers. "My father said the land's not for sale. In the Stark family, that's the end of the conversation." Leach's smile became strained. "Perhaps you don't understand the economic realities. Perhaps you don't understand the cultural realities," Johnny interrupted, his voice carrying the same steel-edged authority that had made his father legendary in Copper Valley. "This land has been in our family for 4 generations. We've buried our dead in its soil and fed our children from its harvest. You could offer us $100 million, and the answer would still be no." The developers left empty-handed, but not before Leach made a parting comment that revealed his true nature. "It would be unfortunate if your family faced any more legal troubles. Sometimes development projects require extensive environmental impact studies that can uncover irregularities in land use practices." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ira and Johnny exchanged a look that communicated volumes about their shared willingness to defend what was theirs. That evening, they sat on the porch discussing the encounter and its implications. "They'll be back," Johnny said, cleaning the hunting rifle he'd been maintaining. "And next time, they won't be asking politely." "Probably not," Ira agreed. "Men like that don't understand the word no until someone teaches them what it means. How do you want to handle it?" Ira smiled at his son's assumption that violent resistance was a viable option. Johnny had learned more than ranch work during his time in prison. He learned that sometimes the world required men willing to use force to protect what mattered. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Ira said. "But it's good to know you're prepared to cross it with me." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jeremy Yu, who'd maintained an informal relationship with the Stark family since Rod's conviction. The federal agent looked older, wearier, as if his investigation into police corruption had cost him some essential optimism about human nature. "Evening, gentlemen," Yu said, accepting the beer Johnny offered him. "I thought you should know, Rod's dead." The news hit both Starks like a physical blow, though for different reasons than you might have expected. "What happened?" Ira asked. "Prison justice. 3 inmates cornered him in the laundry facility this morning. Apparently, word had gotten around about his crimes against children." Johnny frowned. "Children." Part of Rod's corruption involved covering up for a pedophile ring in exchange for payments. When that information leaked to the general population, you shrugged. "Well, you know how prisoners feel about child abusers." Ira felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Rod was finally dead, disappointment that he hadn't been the one to kill him, and a strange sense of closure that justice had been delivered by the very system Rod had tried to manipulate. "How do you feel about it?" Yu asked, studying Ira's reaction carefully. "I feel like the universe has a sense of irony," Ira replied honestly. "Rod spent his career sending innocent people to prison, and in the end, prison is what killed him." Yu nodded slowly. "There's a certain poetic justice to it." After you left, Johnny and Ira sat in comfortable silence, processing the news of their enemy's death. Neither man felt the need to celebrate or mourn. Rod's demise was simply another chapter in a story that was larger than any individual. "Dad," Johnny said eventually, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The land, the ranch, the family legacy. It's all about more than just property, isn't it?" Ira looked at his son, seeing not just the young man Johnny had become, but the patriarch he would eventually be. "What do you think it's about?" "It's about proving that some things can't be bought, stolen, or destroyed. It's about showing the world that there are still families who value honor above profit, loyalty above convenience." And Johnny's smile was cold and certain. and demonstrating that crossing the Stark family carries consequences that last longer than any court sentence. It was exactly the lesson Ira had hoped his son would learn, but hearing it articulated so clearly filled him with both pride and concern. Johnny had inherited the Stark capacity for absolute loyalty and absolute vengeance, but he'd also learned to apply those traits with the kind of calculated precision that made him dangerous. Just remember, Ira said carefully, the goal isn't to become the monster. It's to be prepared to fight monsters when they threaten what you love. I understand the difference, Dad. Do you trust me to maintain it? Ira studied his son's face in the porch light, seeing the intelligence, determination, and controlled ruthlessness that would serve the Stark family well in the years to come. I trust you to do whatever's necessary to protect this legacy, Ira said, even if that means making choices I wouldn't make myself. Johnny nodded, understanding that he'd just received his father's blessing to exceed even Ira's capacity for ruthless pragmatism when circumstances required it. As they sat in the mountain darkness, both men understood that the Stark family had emerged from their trial by fire transformed into something harder and more dangerous than they'd been before. Carmen's betrayal and Rod's corruption had forged them into instruments of justice that operated beyond the boundaries of law and conventional morality. The land would remain in Stark hands for generations to come, protected by men who understood that some legacies were worth killing for and worth dying for. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the valley, their voices carrying the ancient song of predators who survived by being smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than their prey. Ira Stark smiled, recognizing kindred spirits in those wild voices. The Stark family had learned to howl with the wolves, and anyone foolish enough to threaten their territory would discover exactly what that meant. The legacy of iron had been passed from father to son, tempered by betrayal and hardened by revenge. It would endure for as long as there were Stark men willing to pay the price of protecting what they loved. And in the mountains of Montana, where justice had always been a matter of personal accountability rather than legal process, that was exactly as it should be. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.